Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the latest in our series of webcasts. Today, we're talking about global process ownership, overcoming the 5 big challenges to success. And is global process ownership a fad, a temporary fix, or the future? So I know we have a very high demand for this. So we had nearly 1,100 people register. So welcome all of you. And I'm very pleased to be joined by 2 great guest speakers. My name is Dan French. I'm the guy on the left, but I'm very pleased to welcome Shelley Davies, who's the Global Process Excellence and Automation Lead at Anglo American. Welcome, Shelley.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for having me.
And also welcome to Steve Fox, who's a former VP of Global Business Services at Thermo Scientific. Welcome, Steve.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Great to be here.
So our 2 guests have great experience, and we're going to hear from them in some detail. I'm here really to make some introductions, which I've kind of done, but I want to talk a little bit about global process thinking because this is kind of peeling the layers of the onion. There's some elements for us to consider. And then I'm going to ask Shelley and Steve from their own experiences from various organizations to talk us through the why, what, and how of global process ownership and their experiences and what's important and what they would do different next time. And then we're going to come back with some key takeaways and recommendations and a Q&A. So please ask questions as we go through. This is clearly an important topic. So many of you have registered, it clearly resonates with you. So ask questions as you go through. Even at the beginning, we've got a question, open the GoToWebinar Q&A panel, pop your question in, and we will either answer it at the end of this. We've got a Q&A slot, and those we don't have time to answer, we will respond to by email. So please do so, because it's the opportunity to make it most valuable for all of us. So thank you for that. It's a 45-minute session. We're going to try and keep to that. We might be 2 or 3 minutes over, because that's real life, but we're going to be close to 45 minutes. So a bit of context. We ran a poll with global business services leaders and actually finance operations leaders for those organizations that didn't have GBS or shared services. And we asked them a number of questions, and I'm not going to go into all of them, but the one that really interested me was asking them, beyond what's expected of them from their leaders, is their aspirations as professionals themselves. And these 5 I thought were very telling. Number 1, they wanted the enhanced reputation as a value creator as well as a cost reducer, because you can't cost reduce your way to success. They wanted to become a center of excellence with the expertise to optimize and automate as well as operate, which I think is pretty pivotal. And then this big topic of end-to-end business process collaboration was one of those aspirations. We talked a lot about ownership, championing, and collaboration. And we chose collaboration because of some of the challenges with the meaning of the word ownership, but that's absolutely what we're talking about today. The aspiration to digitize integrated processes and having a talent pipeline for the entire business. So that's kind of a context. So this is really front and center of the leadership agenda. But it's important for us to think about what we mean by a business process. There are a lot of terms we use that we just nod. Someone uses the term business process, we all nod, and we assume we're talking about the same thing, but quite often we're not. So I just challenge you to think about, what do we mean by it? And is it a series of actions or steps? Is it the system workflow? Is it the flow chart on the intranet? What is it? And there's a little definition at the bottom there, which I think adds a little bit of depth, which is worth looking at. Now, I'm sure it could be refined, but it's kind of relevant because it's easy to fall into the trap that leads us to think the system is a process, and it isn't. So have a look at that and have a think about whether that affects your thinking at all. But it's important for us to understand what a process is, to have a real idea of what global process ownership is. And of course, particularly in GBS, life is complicated a bit further because we talk about processes and we talk about capabilities and we talk about services, and they're all slightly different variations on a theme. So we know what a business process is. It's a core value stream that delivers something to the customer, and we know examples of that. But we talk also about capabilities, which is the mechanisms by which we deliver and manage processes and service. So global process ownership itself is a capability. It's not a process, and you can see some other examples there. And then the service, we talk a lot about service level agreements. Well, what does a service mean? It's not the same as a process. It's the expectation and delivery from the perspective of the customer, what the outcome is. So I just think it's worth, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but these, semantics are important, because if we're clear on definitions, it makes life a lot easier when we're trying to roll a concept out across a large organization. And we talk about processes, and of course, you know, it's quite easy to forget about data, but data is central to everything we do, and the master data that supports global processes is absolutely key. And I saw this survey recently, I just had to share it, in that an organization did a survey of the scrutiny on master data, in this case for source to pay, purchase to pay, about supplier master data. But it's true for customer master data, product, inventory, employee, the whole thing. And what's interesting about it is the focus of scrutiny on that data is highest in sourcing and onboarding, and least when the real work starts, which is kind of ironic and worth stopping with some pause for thought about, because, you know, that says a lot. And I think that should make us think a little bit about the role of data, our interest in data, particularly as we talk about global process life cycles. Now, we talk about end-to-end process, and we all kind of know what one is. This is an example. This is source to pay. You could do the same for customer to cash, or record to report, or hire to retire. But yeah, this kind of, you know, very kind of simple, cartoonish, kind of get the idea. It's easy to communicate to people in general about what we're referring to. But of course, global processes are really nuanced and complex. So we've got a lot of stakeholders. And here's an example. Again, I'm using source to pay as an example. You know, we've got the same for all the other processes. Just think about the number of folks that are involved, influenced by, and influence the process. And some of them are down there. And that brings to the point that in an end-to-end process, nobody has end-to-end control over the process. Arguably, not even the CEO has end-to-end control over these processes because of external operators. It's all about influence. And I will come back to this, but it's kind of really important for us to recognize that influence is key. So the dynamics of the global process are key. And of course, even the best global process has many routes through it. So here's an example of a journey map. I'm not going to go in detail, but what I want to make clear is a process isn't just one route through a set of activities. The best global process has many journeys, many routes through it. And here's an example for source to pay, purchase to pay. And that's okay. The point is to work out how many of those and which of those are relevant to you, and make sure you've only got the variants that you want and you need, and not ones you don't want, and that if they deliver value for you. So this is our concept of the how to the what of a process, the journey of the route. And of course, you have the same idea for whether it's customer to cash, order to cash, so again, or record to report, or intercompany, often forgotten as an end-to-end process in its own right. And the whole issue of managing risk through performing activities, risk to perform cycle, hire to retire, and so on. So as I kind of come to a conclusion in the introduction, I want to get your opinions here. So you're all here because you've got a stake or an interest or a focus or a challenge in end-to-end global process ownership. So I want to ask you, in your opinion and experience, what's the primary benefit of having end-to-end global process ownership? Is it 1, improving service to customers and stakeholders? Is it 2, enhanced efficiency, faster, better, cheaper? 3, enhanced effectiveness, which is doing the right things? Or 4, improved risk management, control, and compliance? So I appreciate you could say, well, all 4 are important. But I'm asking you, what's the primary benefit? What's the one you'd say is the biggest single one for your organization in your experience and opinion? So have a look at that. It's just 1, 2, 3, or 4. It's all anonymous, so don't worry. There's no right or wrong answer. Just interested to share what we collectively feel here. So the benefit of end-to-end process ownership, why would you do process ownership for which of these 4 outcomes? So give it a go. 1, 2, you've just got to choose 1, 2, 3, or 4. Give it a go, and let's have a look at the results. So, right, so improve, that's interesting. So improved service to customers and stakeholders is the biggest, followed by efficiency, effectiveness, and okay, I mean, there's a reasonable spread across all those, so that's really good. So okay, thank you for that. That's great news. And I've got one more poll for you. So given you've talked about what the benefit is, what in your experience is the primary enabler to deliver that benefit? Is it 1, the transparency and visibility of the process? 2, enhanced process standardization? 3, process collaboration across and beyond the organizational silos? 4, technology and systems? Or 5, continuous improvement and change management? Again, just choose one. I appreciate they're all valid. But what's the most important one in terms of an enabler from your perspective and your experience? So again, is 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? I'm not going to ask you to do any more after this. So just do this one. it's kind of interesting to see where you sit in the big picture. As I say, it's anonymous, just 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, and then I'll let you leave your keyboard alone. Let's have a look at the old scoreboard. So, wow, okay, so process collaboration across and beyond organizational silos. You've read the synopsis of this webcast. That's massive. So that's kind of, I guess that's reassuring. So thank you, everybody. Thanks. So we've looked and we've worked around this global process ownership topic really deeply and with great effort over the recent years. And here's the kind of the 5 big challenges that we see echoing back at us all the time in the work we do. And I'd say that ambitions and aspirations are really high right now, but execution is hard. And the reason it's hard is the control versus influence challenge in the role. I've already referred to that. You know, you can't control all this stuff. It's all about influence. It's building a cross-functional coalition to drive change. There isn't one owner. Driving as-is performance improvement while designing an effective to-be process, the design versus operate balance. The natural tension between process-driven change and technology-driven change, and making sure we understand the difference between the two. And the impact of human behavior on process change, because you know, the more we digitize, counterintuitively perhaps, the more human behavior becomes a critical element of process success. So we're going to hear more about this as we go on. But to my mind, you know, when you look at these issues, as I say, it's like peeling an onion. It's very easy when we think about this to say, oh yes, it's obvious what the answer is, and you tend to find the simple answers to complex, surprisingly complex questions. The simple answers are just wrong, and the right answers usually are about the road less traveled, the complex but right. So that's that kind of interesting little path on the right. And we're going to hear a lot of that from our 2 speakers today. And basically, that's a cartoon representation of the Dunning-Kruger effect. And I know anybody who's attended any of our webcasts or any talks, I am very focused on cognitive bias because I think it has a much bigger impact on our success collectively than we imagine. But this is basically the idea that highly intelligent people, when faced with a problem or a decision or an opinion on the subject they don't have a lot of personal experience on, have a very high degree of confidence, or tend to have a very high degree of confidence. And when you have the challenge to actually execute that decision or plan, as you get into the detail, you realize, wow, this is a lot harder, a lot more nuanced, a lot more complex than we expected, and you get down in that trough. If you're fortunate enough to become a subject matter expert on the right-hand side, your confidence raises, but you're never as confident as you were when you're a naive optimist. And that is a psychological study which is 22, 23 years old, but massively relevant to large organizations. And I just encourage you to think about that because it affects everything we do. But with that as an introduction, I'm very, very pleased to welcome Shelley. As I say, she's Global Process Excellence and Automation Lead at Anglo American. Shelley Davies, tell us about your experiences on global process ownership.
Thanks, Dan. So just a little bit of background about me and my experience. So I started out life as a chartered accountant, but had sort of 15 years plus experience around finance and business process transformation, both within shared service organisations and across the end-to-end finance, both in the capacity of consulting with Accenture and IBM, and more recently I was at BT and now at Anglo American. I think for me, my experience in the global process ownership was when I was at IBM and spent 4 years as the offerings lead for procure to pay. So that was shaping up our outsourcing offering as well as supporting the delivery of those offerings in production. Always had a passion for process and process excellence and automation, and really trying to understand how we get those capabilities, use those capabilities to get us there more quickly. So the first question Dan was asking about, why do we want global process ownership and why is it important? And for me, it is all around that certainty, consistency, and compliance that we want in our finance processes. We're accountants. We're not that keen on surprises, good or bad. So if we know what our processes are, they're visible, they're transparent, etc., then the more certain and more certainty we have in there, and therefore the more likely we will have consistency and compliance. I think as well, in the ever-changing world we live in, if you've got that consistency of approach, they're much more easily adaptable to changing business needs. We don't have to change 15 different versions of the process. We just change it once. And that also makes it simple and much more cost effective to implement new capabilities. There's always new ways of doing things, etc. And again, if you've just got one version of the process, it's much easier to get those implemented. But to do all of that, to be able to adapt quickly, they've got to be simple and easy to navigate. So let's take the complexity out. Let's demystify them, and let's make them as simple and transparent as we can. They need to have clear ownership. So we often talk about a standard process, but a standard process has standard swim lanes. So let's get the work done as well in a consistent way. And have that shared end-to-end culture. So don't let's push problems upstream or downstream of each other, and having that focus on the end customer. And for me, you know, building into our teams that need to continually improve and manage those end-to-end changes. So whether that's new capabilities, adapting to new business requirements, etc., having that curiosity, but within the guardrails of maintaining a standard. So what is it in terms of scope that typically you'd be looking after as a global process owner? I think the first one is that strategy, and really important to have a vision that people can align behind. Really important as well to make sure that that vision is developed in a collaborative way, so that everybody feels part of that vision and it's their vision that they're implementing, not somebody else's. The process governance, there does need to be governance, and that's about maintaining that standard and having the ability to challenge where people want to have an exception to the standard. You know, let's try and keep it to legal and fiscal requirements as opposed to, you know, local behaviours or, you know, just a desire to do things differently. And that process design is important as well, in terms of knowing what good looks like, staying up to date with what's going on, streamlining the processes, reducing the waste, all the things that we know are endemic in a good process. And then that ability to continuously improve and be restless and stretch ourselves. And then we want to manage that, manage about how are we delivering against that standard that we've developed, that strategy, that governance. And that's all through metrics as far as I'm concerned. So whether that's end-to-end process performance, or whether that's through process mining and some of those capabilities, so that we can view the process in terms of data, but then hold the delivery organization accountable for delivering against that. So it's quite a wide remit, and I think what makes it even more complicated is the how, because one thing that the global process owners always have is lots and lots of stakeholders. So lots of organizations these days are built up of multiple business units, all of whom hold the power, and therefore, as Dan mentioned, that role of influencing becomes really, really important. Most organizations don't have, most global process owners don't have a mandate, but they do have the ability to influence and drive businesses towards that standard. So within Anglo, we've created this concept of a process champion. So that's somebody that is within the business unit, that's really the eyes and ears of the global process owner, understands that agenda and is driving that agenda within their business unit, but also representing their business unit back to the global process owner. So if things do need to change because maybe things aren't working on the ground as well as we thought they should, or maybe there's a new requirement, etc., they can be the conduit both up and down from that global process owner to their business unit. But there's always partner functions as well. So if you think about, you know, the source to pay value stream, there's different ways different organizations split that up, but it's rare to see that source to pay reports into one place. So you know, if you're doing invoice to pay in finance, there's a huge dependency on procurement or supply chain. There's tax, there's treasury, there's all these different partner functions that need to be kept in line, and also across the global process owners as well. And then obviously we've got the support functions, and it's really key that those support functions are also in lockstep with the strategy and the vision that's laid out, so that they don't start doing things that could take us away from that standard approach. So important to have that layer of governance over the top of that, to make sure that we hold that that to account. And I did ask a few of my colleagues, present and past colleagues, who are working as global process owners at the moment, to say, well, if you had to tell me, you know, what are the 3 things that you think you need to be successful in the role? And it was interesting, really, because there was, as we expected, an emphasis on the influencing. So, you know, listening and understanding came up quite a bit. Being a domain expert is important. You've got to be credible, and therefore keeping abreast of what's going in the wider industry, understanding what other people are doing, what's new, what else can we bring into the organisation, which ties in with the knowledge of the technology enablers. But I think as well, importantly, is that growth mindset and that whole piece around constantly thinking about how things can change. So, and all of that in the context of being able to create and collaborate on a clear vision, make it simple, but challenge the status quo and being empowered to say no. So I think when I look back at my time at IBM, and just, you know, the way that we see global process ownerships going forward, I think understanding that case for change is critical. So what is it that the organisation is trying to do, and aligning behind that? Never underestimate the number of stakeholders and the need to engage with all of those, so everybody has that common view of the vision and believes in that vision, and that vision becomes theirs. The influencing and change management is vital. I don't think we can say that enough. It's really important that we take those ideas don't just sit on a page as ideas, but they become adopted. Listen, but know when you've listened enough. So this comes back to you do need to listen, you do need to understand, but challenge that status quo and push people to think more widely and work to change the norm, but equally be aware of change fatigue. We've got to let these, you know, as you implement the next iteration of the process, give it time to bed in, give it time for people to accept that as the new norm, and then go again. So as we keep saying, you know, really, really important to take people on that change journey with you.
Well, thank you very much, Shelley. That was really thought-provoking, and I'm sure it's created questions and thoughts in your own mind. So now's the time to get some of those questions in to the panel on GoToWebinar. You can pop those in, and we will endeavour to answer them later, or by email if we don't get to them all. So thanks so much, Shelley. We've got another perspective here. Steve Fox, former Vice President Global Business Services at Thermo Fisher Scientific. Steve, welcome. What are your tell us about your journey?
Great, thanks, Dan. So just first of all, great to be here and having this opportunity to speak to everybody. Just as a kind of a little bit of a background, as Shelley did, you see a little of my experience here. So after kind of spending 3 years cutting my teeth in some accounting and operations roles, and I was introduced to this idea of shared services back in the early 90s. And a big benefit of that experience early on was in the role I was in as a transition manager. I was able to see a lot of the kind of think about the concepts that we take for granted a little bit now around GPOs, but see this idea of as is, to be, process consistency, process standardization, et cetera, et cetera. See that kind of, you know, upfront and very personal. So it really set the kind of the groundwork for me over the next, now almost 30 years, you know, taking that experience and kind of parlaying it into a career, if you will. So when I was, you know, kind of reflecting back on some of my experiences and in the journeys, and as we know it now as global process ownership, or these GPO roles that a lot of you are either in or supervising or you know, promoting for, right, and trying to get established. This idea of executive commitment is always important, and always important to get that and have that kind of backstop, if you will. But what I learned over the years was this idea of coalition is very important, right? And we talk about stakeholders, and a lot of times from the stakeholder point of view, it's very much a one-way street, right? As here's my ask of you and my need of you, and that's fair and necessary and needs to be listened to and acted upon. But also starting to kind of modify that conversation a little bit, because there's going to be asks of the stakeholders too. Is in order for me to do this, for example, harmonize a process or standardize a policy, there may be some asks I need of the business or of the regions or whatever is relevant for your organization. So that two-way street and understanding that is really important. So I always kind of I've migrated to this idea and thought around coalition. And that we talk about process standardization, a lot. And again, pretty easy to say, but as Dan and Shelley both kind of espouse a little bit, getting into the details and getting into kind of the depths of these processes really enlighten you, right? As Dunning-Kruger would portray, right? Enlighten you to learn and understand more than you ever thought you could, or in some cases maybe wanted to, but you need to get to that level in order to be effective. And then I'll talk a little bit about defects here in a little bit, but my focus, kind of has evolved from this idea of productivity and all the classic productivity metrics to let's see what's really going wrong in the process so we can fix that. And so that's this idea of defectivity I'll expound on a little bit. So, the perspective I took on some of these questions around kind of the why, what, and how is really more focused on, I looked at it, more from the people in the role perspective, if you will. So, early on with GPOs and especially when you're in the midst of some transition or some transformative work as far as setting up a center, green or brown field and moving work to and fro, right? Is that some of my main focus for the GPOs was on that transitional work and writing and getting the work in the center, understanding how it gets done, what are the nuances, and really driving the deployment of that plan. And along with that is this idea of, hey, we're doing this for a reason. There is a business case. There's some economics around this, but there's also some key activities around process, policy, and technology harmonization. That's where I was really leaning on my GPOs to drive and deliver on that and kind of raise their hand when they saw issues pop. And clearly you can't get any of these first two things done without building a strong alliance with stakeholders, whether that be business unit leads, regional leads, process leads, really important to drive kind of that understanding and be the ears and the eyes, if you will, of the GBS to make sure that voice of the customer, being the stakeholders and the coalition members, make sure that's heard. And then the question was, hey, what am I really, when we really get down to the nuts and bolts, is what am I asking my GP? What am I really asking them to do? It's like, I wanted them to engage directly. I wanted that frequency to be there, but I wanted them to engage directly with the coalition team. A lot of times GPOs, my GPOs would find themselves in the middle of process, policy, maybe technology issues that they needed to be, whether they were the actual kind of point of resolution there, or the facilitator, or kind of maybe the mediator. That was the role that depending on the issue that I asked them to play, and that was a key part of, especially in the early days of migrating work and setting up centers, was really key. And then I mentioned a little bit around the business case and the work done there. But in many cases that you're setting up a center, you're working on some transition work, there's some new technology or there's a harmonization of technology that's important. And so being able to align on that and align on the actions and the strategy and the deployment, critical. And then we've talked about it as far as the partnership with business and operational leads is key. So I think about that, these are kind of you're never going to encompass all of these things on one page, but these are kind of the high level areas of the what and what I was asking my GPOs to be involved in and deliver on. And so, next, like, okay, great, I got all these things that I gotta work on. What are some of the key characteristics or traits GPOs, and again, in my opinion, that really helps them be successful. And I think Shelley and Dan both talked about the influential aspect of that. More of the influence versus kind of control. Kind of think of control, mandate / demand. Being able to influence is critical. But a couple things I'd focus on here is this idea of being focused and prioritization. GPOs get asked. GPOs, by the nature of the role, get involved in a lot of things, get involved with a lot of people, have a lot of stakeholders and a lot of kind of constituents, if you will, coming at them. Prioritize, right? There's got to be an alignment. This is why that alignment with stakeholders is important. Alignment with GBS, center leads, etc. is so important, because you got, if you can't prioritize, it's really easy to get thrown down a tangential hole, and it's hard to get out of. But that prioritization is key. I also thought it was very, very important for GPOs, and in many cases, maybe in your organization, GPO is in the center, is where the work gets done. But in two of my cases, they weren't. But it was very important. I wanted them to be there. I wanted them to have some visibility, have some presence there, be known, right? It's not just a helicopter trips in and out for a day or 2 days. I wanted them to be a part of it, because that was important to me, that the operational leads and the business leads knew and were familiar with my GPOs. And then I thought real quickly, the last time, be curious, right? Just when you think you know it all, right? Ask another question, and I'm sure you'll, I know, case for me, I'll learn something. So that curiosity is a key trait. So we think about just I'm not going to go through. You guys can read the pages or the words on the slide, but just a few early pivots, right? That I think are important to call out is but initially GPO, GBS center leads separate. It was important as I moved forward and understood kind of how critical they were to one another, and how they needed to be able to be aligned and act and be empowered to act on behalf of each other. It was really important that my GPOs for the various processes had that relationship with the GBS center leads regionally. It was important that they had that familiarity and that confidence in each other to be able to help each other, and in some cases where necessary, act on behalf of one another. And then I would say that this third bullet point around kind of this idea of EQ, right? As the GPO roles have evolved in my experience, moving from a transitional work to and setup work to really more of the day in, day out kind of year-over-year productivity objectives, is really important that I had GPOs with high EQ, had the ability to influence, to mediate, to collaborate. Was critical, and I learned early on, I in some of my GPO roles, I didn't have that, so I needed to either train that or get that. But kind of to wrap up here my section a little bit, I talked earlier about this idea of defectivity or defect focus, and it's something that it took me a while to learn, and I'll say have an appreciation for. Because it's always like, hey, the transactions per FTE, the cost per billion of revenue, all those things, and all those are necessary and needed, and are asked for, quite frankly. But this idea of focusing on defects and fixing defects is really important. And in my experience, just kind of by definition, by reducing defects, you're increasing productivity. If you're focused on the right defects, right? Productivity, it doesn't always just take care of itself, but in a lot of cases, eliminating those defects has a very, very positive impact on your productivity. And then this idea, kind of mid-page here on balance, being balanced from a time management perspective. I think it's easy. I'll use an example in my experience. It's easy for a subject matter expert, right, that kind of grows up in the process and becomes a GPO to be, hyper focused and quite frankly hypersensitive on the operational side, which is great. But I also learned I need to have my GPOs need to have an eye on strategy and on the future and kind of the vision and mission, where we want to take, the process, as well as ensuring that they had a high degree of focus on stakeholders and on this coalition. So when I think about the balance of time for GPOs, it's kind of, a third is what I found worked best. in my experience. So with that, Dan, I'll kind of wrap up my section and hand it over to you to take us home.
Thanks very much, Steve. Another really great, thought-provoking set of experiences. So thank you both, Shelley and Steve. You've given us a lot to think about. Again, please ask your questions now while it's fresh in your head. Get the questions down, because this is a valuable interchange, which I want us all to get the most from. So we've heard these two really compelling experiences. So what can we learn from that? Now, I'll just come back to these 5 common themes. We've heard a lot about this from both Shelley and Steve. You know, it's like control versus influence, this cross-functional coalition to drive change, the as-is versus the to-be, the tension between process and technology, and human behavior. These are the big 5. And I think we've heard some good ideas about that. And I'll develop a little bit on this, because one of the things that becomes very clear to me, and it's kind of, you know, really in the fabric of both what Shelley and Steve said, is, you know, we tend to assume it's one of these things that seems obvious when people say, what does good look like for order to cash, purchase to pay, or whatever? And it kind of seems like an obvious question that there ought to be an obvious answer to, but believe me, there isn't an obvious answer, and it's the hardest question in the world. So we've got to get to the nub of that really as fast as we can, but it's about collaboration, it's about influence. So the picture at the bottom is about the different lighthouses. So, you know, if it's source to pay, you've got sourcing and procurement, you've got the business units that actually need the goods or services, and you've got, you know, finance and GBS sort of doing the settlement piece. You know, they all have a different view and a different kind of focus from their executives. Our job is to align that to a common view of what good looks like, because what good looks like to any one of those is slightly different. And I have to say, it's the hardest thing in the world. I run a business, and it's hard to do for me as well. So I know how hard this is, and it's one of the biggest things to do. And the way to do it, in my experience, is start with why, and then look at the what, and only then look at the how. And of course, how includes technology, right? So the what is people, process, technology, and data. We talked about the what as the process, the end-to-end process, and the how are those journeys through that we talked about, the journeys, the routes through the process, both as is and to be. And if you can do that, you can start to really understand, you can start to align expectations. And Steve and Shelley talked about this as well. You know, productivity isn't enough. I mean, everyone asks us for productivity because it's the obvious lagging indicator. But performance measures, frankly, are not as useful as we like to think they are. The big value is in leading indicators, which is about defects. What goes wrong? You know, this is kind of the piece of the small things that have big impacts, the barriers to the long-term positive result. It's like, you know, it's like looking at the engine of a car. You know, you look at the dashboard, frankly, it doesn't tell you a lot. It might stop you getting a speeding ticket, but it's knowing how that engine's working, and if there's anything wrong with it, will actually help you drive 500 miles. So this whole point about leading indicators for lagging indicators and defectivity is a critical focus for the global process owner if they want to be successful. And of course, to do that, you've got to guide it with data, and we've heard both from Shelley and Steve about that. But it's not just about activity and trends, and it's not just about performance, although people want to know what performance is. It's about defects. What's wrong? Give me the insight of what's not going right. And if you think there's nothing not going right, you're missing the point. There's a lot not going right. And my recommendation, and this is hard, right? But we're all pushed on KPIs. Avoid the KPI discussion until you really know what good looks like. You know, and I know, to really understand what good looks like for an end-to-end process is a hard, complex discussion with a lot of listening and a lot of harmonization and a lot of collaboration. Until you've got that, KPIs are irrelevant. And so all this stuff, whatever this, this set of performance measures, these cost pers, pointless. Now, I know it's hard, but you've got to have the courage to say, we want to focus on what good looks like, and then we will agree on the KPIs. Doing the KPIs first is just a recipe for disaster, because there are so many unintended consequences of the wrong KPIs, and you see it all the time. So automation, digitization, I love this quote because it is so true. The first rule of any technology is when automation is applied to an efficient operation, it magnifies the efficiency. Makes sense. The second is applying technology to an inefficient operation will magnify the inefficiency. And that is so important. But the number of times we see technology leading the change results in exactly that second issue. So, you know, that's really, really important to remember. And it's kind of obvious, but we get lost in it in the kind of deep in the operations. And there's some lovely quotes here from businesses who work with. Yeah, automation makes bad worse faster. I cannot find a better phrase than that. You know, make sure you get rid of the bad before you start automating it. And elimination is the best form of automation. Again, you know, do all the elimination before you start digitizing, because it makes the whole thing simpler, and simplicity is what we're looking for. And we do find that digital tail is wagging the process dog a little bit too often. But simplicity is the essence, and Shelley talked about it, Steve talked about it. And this is a kind of the trouble with the English language. Simplicity is a derivation of simple, so you think it's simple, right? But simplicity is the hardest thing in the world to achieve. I can't remember who said it, but you know, I wanted to write you a short letter, but I didn't have time, so I wrote you a long letter, is a famous quote. And it reflects the fact that simplicity and bringing things down to essentials takes time, real hard work. And that's a Steve Jobs quote. You know, it's the hardest thing in the world, but the most valuable outcome is simplicity. When you think about the global process owner, what do we need from them? And both Shelley and Steve talked about their views of the role. Yeah, there's two things. You need an IQ, clearly a big IQ that you can deal with the levels of abstraction. You've got to be able to be down that tunnel on the left, blocking and tackling the issues, but you've got to be able to move up and take a helicopter view and make sure that the tunnel you're in is the right tunnel, get into the right place, and that maze is the maze we're meant to be battling through. And on the right-hand side, we've got to have the EQ, because it's about winning hearts and minds. It's about influence. We can't tell people what to do. It just doesn't work in today's world, in this complex environment we're in. So you need to look for a strong IQ, strong EQ, strong experience, and you know, that's a very, very important balance. So what we do, and taking a lot of what we heard already, what we do is we try to you know, put a kind of GPO playbook together for organizations to help global process owners, global process ownership teams, the organizations, and the organizations as a whole, to help create an environment for driving global process change at pace. And these are some of the essence of it, and it's, you know, it forms a educational training class and workshops and so on. But you can get the idea from that, because we've talked about a lot of it already, about identifying and mapping end-to-end process and journeys. We've talked about that. We've talked about the coalition. We've talked about communication and the power of EQ. You know, there's a lot of stuff here which isn't just about tasks, it's about our behavior. So I think that's a very, very powerful playbook which you should consider in the work you're doing. And when you do this, you've got to, and Steve and Shelley both referred to it, you don't build a powerful coalition and forget about it. You've got to keep building it, because people's opinions change, their emotions wax and wane, and of course you get new people in. So we've got to keep building the coalition as we go on. It's a never-ending activity. And as we're tasked with optimizing our end-to-end process, you know, this idea of make sure we understand it well, the as is, make sure we analyze it, we adjust it, we simplify, and then we automate, and then we measure and refine. It's a powerful approach, but making sure we take that sequence, whatever the pressures are, this is proven to be the most effective and fastest route to success. Chucking in the automation before we thought about it, you know, frankly, we know what it results in. And you end up, I have a lot of colleagues and friends who say, you know what, we've done all this deployment, but I think if I had my time again, we'd have spent more time on the process first. It would have been quicker. So don't let the great be the enemy of the good, particularly in the economic times we are in, and we're entering turbulent times. If we thought they were turbulent before, they're going more turbulent now. So we've got to be able to deliver Pareto incremental value, short and sharp, regular, and not just focus on big strategic, these red line, big strategic initiatives. And you can have a strategic initiative or strategic goal as an aspiration, but we've got to deliver regularly on that Pareto, that green line, incremental value, informing strategy and developing agility. So from our point of view and your point of view, you've got to consider the options. Both Steve and Shelley have slightly different models, and there's options you've got to take. You've got to consider the options. What works best in your organization? What's the scope that works best? What's the reporting lines? And you've got to make that decision. But whichever way you go, there's no quick fixes, right? We know there's no quick. It's hard work with, you know, smart, high EQ people working hard and building the the coalition across the organization. So we've talked through this. I hope you found it useful, but we've got some questions for you now, and I know we're at 45 minutes. We've got a couple of questions to go through. So keep the questions coming. We're going to have to deal with a lot of these by email, but I'm going to bring Shelley and Steve back in. These are some of the questions we got in early, so thank you for that. Some of you submitting them even before we started, which is great. So you can see some of the questions we've got. There's a whole bunch more. I'm just going to ask Steve and Shelley to comment on a few of these. So, question here: where should a GPO report? At what level? Manager, director, or VP? At what level are they most effective? So, Shelley, what's your take on that?
Yeah, hi Dan. So I think it's got to be at a level that gives them a right to have the right place at the table. So they've got to be considered to be at least a peer of the people that they're trying to influence. So and sometimes, you know, those job titles of manager and director and VP do vary. But you know, when I was at IBM, it was certainly at director level. But I think the important thing is it's to be at least a peer of the people that you're influencing. Thanks,
Shelley. Steve, what's your take?
Yeah, I would just level wise. My experience was I had my GPOs at the same level as my site leaders at the GBS centers regionally. So in my nomenclature, that was either director or senior director. And as far as where the GPOs should report, I mean, obviously that's highly variable, but I would say what I found worked best is that in order to influence business leaders and people outside of the GBS, it was important to have that reporting maybe like corporately, but also there had to be a very, very strong dotted line to the operational leaders, so they could influence what happened there as well.
That's great. And I also think that the credibility piece is important, but we can't rely on the job title to create the credibility. We've got to make sure we've got people who can deliver that credibility and have a job level to support it. So thank you both for that. So how should the global process owner work together with the BPO, which could be business process operator or business process outsourcer? And how do we ensure the two don't overlap? So Shelley, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, so it's absolutely vital that they do work together, because you've got to see what the translation of that, the global process standards, how they're manifesting themselves in reality. I think in terms of roles and responsibilities, I think it's difficult if the global process owner also has direct responsibility for delivery, because delivery can be very consuming in terms of focus and priorities, and therefore it's easy to get sucked into day-to-day life. But I think it depends on the scale of your organization and lots of other factors as to what the right model is. But absolutely vital that the two are lock, stock, and you have that upwards communication, you know, in terms of what's working and what's not working, but also alignment to the strategy.
Thanks, Shelley. Steve?
Yeah, just very quickly, I would just say it was always important to me that the GPOs and the BPOs understood each other's kind of top 3 to 4 objectives and deliverables and what they were kind of on the hook for, if you will, because they both would bring, in my opinion, and experience, very different perspectives to it, right? Where a GPO can help the BPO get to where they want to go by influencing and leading and driving change and leveraging policy and technology and process to do that. Whereas then on the BPO side, you know, by them delivering the results to the business, that gives the GPO kind of, I'll say, the ammunition, if you will, to go back and say, hey, we can do this and we can help you with this. So it was very important, right, that they were aligned on that and that they leverage their skills and what they're actually, you know, them and their teams are very good at to augment one another's deliverables.
Thank you. One more, I think, before we call it a halt. So how do you inspire leaders to follow the new why and involve them to get it realized? What are the best communication methods and practices? So Steve, do you want to give us your thoughts?
Yeah, just quickly, you know, kind of in a few words, I'd say, you know, as far as methods, practices, I'd say it's targeted, frequent, short, with the right audiences, right? So I tend to limit these kind of meetings, etc., and updates to 30 minutes and make sure I had the right audiences involved. And as far as inspiring leaders, I think this goes back to this idea we've talked a lot about around influencing and you know, kind of it's kind of an exercise of putting your arm around some of these leaders, business leaders, and saying, hey, you know what, I can help you and your business get to where you need to get, but you got to help me do my job, and be a voice of kind of that, you know, influencing, remediating, or mediating and collaborating is key.
Thanks, Steve. And Shelley, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think I just focused in on the word follow, and I think that was what I think. I wouldn't use the word follow because I think people aren't good at following. I think what they have to do is feel that they've been part of that journey, and their points have been understood, and they can relate to that vision and indeed embrace it as their own. So then they're implementing something that they want to implement, as opposed to feeling as though they're following a directive. So I think it is back to, you know, that common theme that we've been talking a lot about on this call, which is about the influencing, the co-creation, the communication, the spending time with those people, and making sure that they feel part of that solution.
Thank you, Shelley, and thank you, Steve. That's been outstanding. We have a number of other questions, as you can see, and there's more coming through as we speak. If you, you know, we're 5 minutes over time, so I do appreciate your time. A big thank you to Shelley and Steve. They've given us great insight from their experience. Thank you for joining us. I hope you found it inspiring, but also kind of informative. And I think it's a really critical topic. So thank you all, and I look forward to speaking next time. And thank you, Shelley. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.